everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Decentralized Radio. Today, we have an incredible podcast lined up for you. We're also live on X, on YouTube. We're doing this on Tuesdays, so check us out on those platforms if you want to catch us live and ask questions. We will relay them to the guest, which today is Dr. Gerald Pollack, who is a leading researcher and expert on water, author of Cells, Gels, Engines of Life, also The Fourth Phase of Water, also a few books before that on muscle contraction, I believe, which is cool. I would like to check those out. But Dr. Pollack, how are you doing today? Thanks for joining.
I'm doing just fine, and thank you for mentioning those books. Um, much, much enjoyment writing them, and a few more on the agenda.
I really love your writing style. I love you make it very digestible, especially for these topics that are kind of not talked about very often and questioning, the mainstream narrative. And that's why we're so excited to have you here on Decentralized Radio because that's what we're all about. And we've talked a lot about water and adjacent conversations in our biology, how it functions. But now we get to really dig in. And I'm curious at the end to get into the book you have coming up next because that's really in my territory. I didn't know that you were an electrical engineer in undergrad. That's my undergrad as well. So we have that in common, which is really fun. And who knew that water was so electrical, which
Oh
we will
yeah.
get into. But I'm gonna let Ryan ask a few of the introductory questions. So Ryan, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I have been preparing for this for at least a solid 6 months theoretically, and then the last 5 days very heavily. So I'm super excited because I now have a much better understanding of water, but just an appreciation for water, specifically this exclusions on water that we're going to be talking about. But let's sort of start out with just the heavy hitter, easy ones where a lot of people know what water is as H2O, but how is the water in our biology different from the water that we drink?
Well, first of all, it's not H2O. What's in our body is actually different from H2O. So H2O has three phases, the solid, liquid, and vapor phases. And we discovered in our experimental work, we discovered what amounts to a different phase of water. And that phase fills our bodies, it fills all our cells. And it has many interesting properties, and those properties actually or the physical chemical properties of the water we're talking about, this so-called fourth phase water that sometimes we call it EZ or exclusion zone water, because it has a tendency to exclude particles and solids, just like ice, pretty much. And it does resemble ice in some ways. It's not solid; it's gel-like, and it fills your body, or it fills our bodies, mine and yours. You see, cell biology right now. Um, if you read a cell biology book, it starts with a discussion of water, chapter one, right away, and then for the rest of the book, the word water is ignored, and and the idea is that cells are filled with liquid water, and and all that the liquid water does is it um, dissolves the more important molecules of life. That's what the book tells you. So it touches on water to begin with, but then it completely forgets about water for the rest of the book. Well, everything that we found in the laboratory is completely antithetical to that. Water, it's really, you might say, the opposite of what's in the cell biology book, because the book says that water does basically nothing, and what we find from our experimental evidence is that water does everything, completely different. And the way you can tell, a lot of people think, oh well, my cells are filled with water, not liquid water, nothing else. So if you take what you might consider to be a typical cell, and that is a raw egg, okay? So and take the raw egg white. Is it a liquid or is it a gel? I think that everybody would say that it's a gel, and and gels have the consistency of easy water. It's filled with easy water. So that's one way of kind of discerning that cells are filled with easy water, not with liquid water. But there's another way if you're brave enough, and I guess you guys are pretty brave. So you take a razor blade, really sharp razor blade, and you take your arm and run it along your arm. So you cut yourself. Now, if your cells were filled with liquid water, the water would come pouring out as it would from a breached water pipe. But that's not what happens. The water or whatever aqueous entity is inside the cell, it stays inside the cell. It doesn't come. You got plenty of blood coming out, but you don't have water coming out. And the same thing will be told to you by surgeons. You know, they'll open up your belly, go digging deep, and take their scalpel and cut through a muscle. And to their surprise, what comes out is not water. They expected water to come out, but water doesn't come out. It's a gel that's inside. And the gel, it's basically a gel because it consists of easy water, which has gel-like properties. So you asked me a simple question, and I've given you a complicated answer, but that's the way it goes.
So we have this gel-like water in our biology, and again, if anyone hasn't read the cells, gels, engines, you kind of poke through these, dogmas, I guess you call them, really, just this thought that has been taught for decades, and there's simple tests to prove that. Like you're saying, if you cut yourself, or if you puncture a cell, you'd expect a lot of things to happen, a lot of things to come out, the cell to die, and it doesn't. So my question to you is, how does this exclusion zone form in our biology? We have bulk water, so we do have some form of normal water. What is the relationship between the exclusion zone and then the bulk water?
Okay, good question. So I I I will convey this to you in a sense historically. Um, and we started. I had been studying muscle contraction for several decades. I got interested in water when I listened to a lecture from a guy named Gilbert Ling. And Gilbert Ling um, came from China. He was in the first cohort um, uh, of young investigators to come from China to the US after World War II. It was 1948 that he came. They picked three people. They picked a physicist, a chemist, and a biologist. He was the biologist. They picked these people from all throughout China. And the physicist went on to win a Nobel Prize. And my Chinese student tells me that the chemist also won a Nobel Prize, but I'm not sure of that. And Gilbert Ling was the kind of guy, his um, his experiments and his theories and whatever should have won at least two Nobel Prizes, but they passed him by. He was very controversial. His main point was that inside the cell, the water is not like liquid water, or I should say, not like this glass of water that I have here. He said that the molecules are aligned. They kind of stack on one another. The water molecules stack on one another, just like soldiers at attention. And when I heard that, I was completely captivated by it. And actually, I gave one of his books to some of my students, and they all came back saying, "This is so incredible. This is really important. And if if he's right, then all of biology will need to be rewritten because it's based on a different presumption." Well, so that's when we started. I wrote the book Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life to make Gilbert Ling's ideas compatible with a rudimentary understanding. Gilbert, he passed a few years ago at age 100. Gilbert was brilliant, but like many brilliant people, somehow they haven't the capacity to present their work, their written work, in digestible form, easily digestible form. And Gilbert was one of those. It may be that in the Chinese language the word editing is absent. I don't know. I'm not sure. But our stuff, we write something and we look at it a few days later and say, well, what did I write? I can't really understand what I've written. Editing is absolutely essential, but he never did a whole lot of editing. So in the book that I wrote, The Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life, 2001, I tried my best to make his ideas palatable. But after doing that, it was so intriguing that obviously we had to look into it and see, um, what could we do to amplify what Gilbert Ling had found. And just to mention, I mean, I'll tell you how that led to easy water in a moment, but um, um, it's just that we well we had there was no choice. We had to study water because it was so intriguing. We started with Gilbert Ling's idea, and so his idea was that this special kind of water, which he called structured water, as did other people, um, has a capacity. It's like a crystal. All the molecules are organized, as is the case in a crystal. And so, if you have a pure crystal, it means that any contaminants that were there originally need to be excluded. You need to get rid of the contaminants to have something that's pure. And since it's like a crystal, um, and it excludes, we started doing experiments looking for something, some what we thought might be crystalline like, and something that excludes. And we found it rather quickly due to a few quirks, that or a few lucky breaks, meeting the right people, knowing the right people, getting the right hints. And that way it turned out to be very simple. So what that is you take a chamber and you put some sort of material in the chamber. We started out using gels. It was actually a polyvinyl alcohol gel, but it doesn't matter because all hydro um, aqueous gels, that is a gel built from water, um, they all show the same phenomenon. So we took the gel, we put it in the chamber, we added water, and we added little particles. We used microspheres, and we were hoping to find some region where the microspheres were excluded, because if there's a crystal there, the crystals, a pure crystal, would exclude those particles, those microspheres. And we found it, and we found it right away. We found it right next to the gel, right next to the gel. At first, at time equals 0, at first, the microspheres were uniformly disposed. And if you were to watch it, which we did, over a period of 5 or 10 minutes, you'd find that right next to the gel, the microspheres started to disappear. They began to be excluded. And that's why we call it exclusion zone. They began to be excluded. And about 7 or 8 minutes after the process started, the exclusion zone became basically constant. So a zone built right next to the gel, and since then next to many surfaces, if they're hydrophilic or water loving. And that exclusion zone, it turned out, had properties, numerous properties that we measured, and each physical chemical property differed from the properties of ordinary water. So we began to call it fourth phase water because it was much more interesting than just excluding particles. Later, we found it excludes virtually everything. It doesn't exclude everything because we don't know, because we haven't studied everything, but it's generally exclusive, and it's a pretty pure liquid crystal. So does that answer your question about how we found it? Please ask. If not, I'm happy to expound further.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's fascinating.
Oh, yeah, no, I was just going to say what I found really fascinating about it is when you think of water generally and then this exclusion zone water, what another property that sort of makes it unique is that it's net negatively charged. And I sort of wanted you to just get into briefly about why that is unique, but also why it is important from an energy perspective when we think about things as maybe this idea of water being a battery, as opposed to thinking about ATP as the energy currency. I've heard you talk about that pretty at length, but
Oh,
I
you
find it
asked
super
5 different
fascinating.
questions, but
Yeah, no, I know. We'll start
okay,
with
yeah,
the net negative
yeah.
charge. Why
So
that?
we didn't know that it was negatively charged. We found So there's this exclusion zone sitting next to the gel, and then there's ordinary water. And having having training in electrical engineering, you can understand that we were curious about the electrical properties of the zone. So we stuck electrodes into the exclusion zone, two electrodes, because if you want to measure potential difference, you need a reference. So one electrode in that zone, and the other electrode in some remote position inside the water. And lo and behold, we found it's not neutral, it's negatively charged. And we were astonished because, who would have expected that it's negatively charged? Later, we began to reason, well, wait a second, we started with neutral water. If this zone is negatively charged, there got to be positive charges somewhere else, because, you can't just create negativity, unless you have a negative outlook, can't create negativity without having positivity, right? Because you need to add minus and plus to give you what you started with, which is neutral. And we found it. And the positive charge consisted of protons, or in fact, hydronium ions, because protons combine immediately with water molecules to give you so-called hydronium ion, which is really nothing more than sort of positively charged water. And that existed just beyond the exclusion zone. So you've got negative exclusion zone next to positive hydronium ions, negative, positive, that's a battery. So we found that the original water molecule, or water molecules, I should say, is what we started with. They're neutral. They have no energy, no nothing, but they separated. They separated into what constitutes a battery. And we found if we stick one electrode in the negative, another electrode in the positive, we could, so you got a potential difference, run some wires to an LED lamp, we could light the lamp. So it means that from water, to start with, just putting the water next to a hydrophilic surface, we get a battery. And this battery can, proof of principle, can produce electrical energy. So of course, the question arises, how much electrical energy can be produced, and we haven't gotten to that stage yet. We don't know how much can be produced, but if you think about it, it could be substantial, and when scaled up. And the reason that I think it could be substantial is that this process of separating into plus and minus, or minus and plus, is the same thing that happens in photosynthesis. The first step of photosynthesis is through light. The light is incident on the plant, and then in the plant there's water, and the water separates into plus and minus, OH minus and H plus. This has been well known for a lot of years, and the separation is said to be 100% efficient. Well, if what we found is related to the first step of photosynthesis, and I think it is, probably nature has done the job better than we can do it, and you got 100% efficiency. What we found is very similar, the breakage into plus and minus. It might be that our process is also highly efficient, though maybe not as efficient as in the plant, because nature does it best. So that's pretty interesting, and it leads me to the natural follow-up. What energy goes into charge of this battery, or create the battery, because all batteries, your your phone, you forget to plug it in, it doesn't work. It's got to get recharged, right? And so for the plant, it's light. And lo and behold, before we could even envision this kind of energy getting transferred into electrical energy, we had no idea. And I found myself scratching my head, trying to figure out, where does the energy come from? Because you can't create energy from nothing. All you can do is you can take one kind of energy and convert it into another kind of energy. That's one of the standard laws of physics and chemistry that I think it makes sense, and I believe it's accurate. So we were looking for, now you can't take the chamber and plug it into a receptacle in the wall. That won't give you energy. I suppose you could devise a way of doing it. So we didn't know where it came from. It turns out that an undergraduate student who didn't really know anything in any sophisticated way, he found the answer. And he was sitting, standing actually, at a bench, a laboratory bench, um, and he was playing around with a chamber that I described a few minutes earlier, just a hydrophilic surface in water, and the water is filled with microspheres, looking at exclusion zones. And I guess maybe he was bored or maybe he was curious. I'm not sure which. He found a gooseneck lamp right next to him. He picked up the lamp and shined it on the chamber. And he saw something astonishing. So he called me in and I looked at it. The region of the exclusion zone that was illuminated by the lamp, the size of the exclusion zone grew to roughly 3 times the size. We've seen up to 10 times the size. It's really powerful. 3 times the size as the other regions that were not illuminated. So, it didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that the energy seemed to be coming from light, just like the photosynthesis issue. So we didn't know what wavelengths of light, because that incandescent lamp contains a range of wavelengths, ranging from, at the short wavelength range, from UV through the visible range, because you can see it, through the infrared, because you can feel the heat. And so we did experiments and using LEDs of specific wavelengths, and we found that ultraviolet did nothing. Actually, it does something, but it's another discussion. The visible spectrum, almost nothing. When we got to the long wavelengths of red, we saw a very small effect, and we went beyond the red to infrared, the longer wavelengths. It was astonishing what we found. Very tiny amounts of infrared energy could expand the exclusion zone enormously. We found up to 10 times. We found in some experiments. So basically, it's light. It's infrared light, and that, I guess, that furthers the concept that what we're looking at is very similar to the first step of photosynthesis. Light comes, it breaks water, but we kind of understand now what happens when the water breaks into negative and positive. So what we may be looking at is indeed a generic form of photosynthesis, or the first step in photosynthesis, where the energy comes from light. Now, a lot of people, you didn't ask me this, but a lot of people don't know very much about infrared light. You know that if you got a toaster, you put the bread in, you push down. If you look inside, you see the coils glowing bright orange. And a lot of people will say, "Oh, I feel the heat and the orange color. It must be infrared coming from that." And they're right. But infrared comes from virtually anything. So um, you can turn off all the lights in your studio or wherever you are, and try to do a selfie. You won't get it because there's not enough light, and if it's dark enough, even your eyes are not powerful enough to see. But if you take a camera, an infrared camera, that is an ordinary camera, but the lens, instead of being sensitive to the visual wavelengths, it's sensitive only to infrared wavelengths. It'll get a beautiful image of everything in your room. And that's because infrared is being emitted by everything in your room. Now, if you put it in front of the light that's shining on your face, that's a lot of infrared energy, but you can get it from the pictures and the bookcase and whatever. And that's why the military uses it as a night light, because you want to check out where the tanks are, from the enemy at night. They might be moving around. Take your infrared camera, and you can see those tanks beautifully. You can even see the trees. You can see everything, essentially. So it means that the energy, infrared energy, that's required for building or transforming water into easy water is there all the time, which means there's a lot of easy water around. And if you crank up the intensity, so you get more infrared energy, you get more easy water. So, long answer to your short question.
Yeah, it's such a incredible thought experiment that this may be the main energy source or maybe a primary, and it's again that's threatening the centralized narrative of ATP being an energy currency. And I want to maybe table that, but you say you don't really know how, say, the quantification of the total difference in potential of the water in our body. And I think about it as something that you talk a lot about is just how pervasive water is. It's what, 55 to 70% of our, you know, biology. And then by molecule count, it's 99% or above that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, you can imagine that that adds up quite quickly. But where I want to take this with the light story is, yeah, near infrared light is tremendous. And we're going to talk to Scott Zimmerman, who has written some great papers with Russell Reiter talking about the benefits of near infrared light from the melatonin synthesis perspective in the mitochondria. But it's sunlight, right? Like it's two places, I should say. It's sunlight during the day. What, 50% of the spectrum is near infrared, and we don't get out outside enough, so that might have an effect. But then what I want to ask you maybe is something that you just mentioned there at the end, and that's that we're all emitting infrared light internally, as heat, right, or in some form. There's so many, I guess, biological functions. There's absorption spectras and then emission spectras, and a lot of them seem to be in the infrared range. So how do you think about, I guess, the importance of the mitochondria in this scenario, in this perspective? Because not only is the mitochondria producing water, but it's also producing heat, which then would be infrared as a byproduct, I guess, which is so cool because most systems, most motors in the real world that produce heat, it just gets lost. But our bodies actually seems to be utilizing this quite in a clever fashion.
Well, okay. Um, well, I think a little bit differently about the question you just asked. So, if you look at the structure of a mitochondrion, it's got a lot of membranes, internal membranes, and um, the shape and structure of of a mitochondrion is such that it's going to have a lot of easy water in it, because any water that's inside the mitochondria will be near one of these hydrophilic membranes, and it'll generate easy water. So I used to think that the mitochondria will ensure that there's plenty of easy water in the cell, but I can never figure out how the easy water gets out of the mitochondria and into the cytoplasm of the cell. And then I realized that it might be different from that. It might be that it's not um, that it's not the easy that comes out, but the negative electrical charge that comes out and feeds the rest of the cell. So what we found is, if we stick a, let's say, negative electrode in a certain region of a chamber full of water, what we found is, right when the electrons pass from the electrode into the water, what was originally liquid water turns into easy water. Um, and so, that being the case, and we have published experiments that demonstrate that, if that's the case, it's easier for me to envision a negative charge coming from the mitochondrion into the cytoplasm to build easy water in the cytoplasm of the cell. Um, so that we have no evidence for that, but this is the current thinking, because it's easy. It's easy to imagine that coming out of the mitochondrion, charge can pass through almost anything, and the cell is full of easy water, but that easy water over time may diminish for various reasons, and you may need replacement. And so the replacement from the mitochondria constitutes energy. Basically, you're putting charge into the cell. You're putting electrons. So that's how I see the mitochondria right now. I may be wrong, but my intuition says that this is really the case. Negative charge is particularly important for us, for all of our activities, and positive charge not, the opposite. So it's because the cell is full of easy water. It needs the easy water. Um, so, what the cell does for a living, so to speak, and this is described in my fourth phase of water book, which deals with cell biology. And the evidence that I presented, it covers basically half the book, is that for a variety of cells, some of the more important cells, um, and perhaps even more pervasively than that, what happens is when a cell goes into action, there's a phase, so-called phase transition. So, for example, just take a muscle cell, for example. Now, a lot of the time, the muscle cell is sitting, not contracting; it's relaxed, just sitting there doing nothing. And in that situation, um, the water is easy water, and and the proteins are in a kind of extended state, like a strand of spaghetti. When the cell goes into action, that is, when the muscle begins contracting, um, the cell undergoes a massive transition. Everything changes. So the water changes from easy or fourth phase water to ordinary liquid water, and then after that precipitates the contraction because the proteins also change. It's not just the water, but the proteins undergo a conformational change from long extended to folded protein, and that action is really what creates the contraction. When the contraction is over, when your muscle wants to relax, then it's a reverse transition, and it once again goes back to the easy state and the extended proteins. And I think that's a generality. I think that generality applies possibly to most, if not all cells. It's not something that we've realized or we think about, but I present a whole bunch of evidence in the book to suggest that in fact is exactly what's going on inside the cell. So that being the case, if the cell, let's say the cytoplasm undergoes that transition from easy water to ordinary water, it means it's losing charge somehow. It's losing electrons because it goes from basically the action potential means where things start. It means the cell has gone from negative, easy water, negative, to bulk water, neutral or almost neutral. So it means that when you want to return to the original state, you need negative charge. And so where does that negative charge come from? Well, it could come from outside the cell, but I think it comes mostly from the mitochondria. So I'm trying to draw a full circle as to how the cell restores itself to the initial condition. It needs negativity to build the easy water from bulk water, and it gets it, at least in part, from mitochondria.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that answers.
I
I forget
makes
what
it
your
makes a
question
lot of
was.
sense.
Uh,
It was more so an open-ended thought on the importance of the mitochondria, and I don't know if you're familiar with what's his name, Andre Sommer's work, but he has this cool proposition that everyone always says the cytochrome C oxidase is like the main, acceptor of red and near infrared light. When, we know from your work that water is extremely attractive to these wavelengths or vice versa, I guess you would say. And he theorizes that the water, cytochrome C, and then cytochrome C oxidase actually act like a field effect transistor in the mitochondria. And it's really the water, the interfacial or interfacial water that is kind of that key. And I love that you just highlighted that because it's not often discussed how exactly the water is getting into the cell and its cytoplasm. Um, so I just wanted to mention that. But I guess what you're talking about at the end there is the importance of electron flow, right? And
Absolutely.
where so you're saying that the electrons are mostly coming, the negative charge is mostly coming from the mitochondria then to build the EZ, or are there other places? We talk a lot about things like grounding on the show that can build up the EZ
Well, I mean, that's a good
potentially,
point
and I want to get your
about
thoughts on it.
grounding or
And
earthing. Yeah.
I want to talk about electron flow. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Well, that's a great place to start to talk about electron flow, because the Earth is negatively charged. Now, those of us who studied electrical engineering never heard anything about the Earth being negatively charged. I studied, when I was studying electrical engineering as an undergraduate, um, no professor ever even hinted that if you plug into the wall, that third prong is going anywhere except to a blandly neutral Earth. Uh, and and so, I thought, like almost everybody else thinks, well, the Earth is neutral. There's no reason for the Earth to be charged, or to be negatively charged or positively charged. And then one day, I had this Russian guy who was working in my lab for 6 months or so, and he was always busy working. And once you turned him on, he'd have a lot to say about a lot of things. And so I was kind of mostly doing my own thing. And it was just the day that he was taking off to return to Russia that I was listening a bit more intently to his always interesting but lengthy conversation. And he was telling me about the Earth's electric field. And I said, Andre, you mean the Earth's magnetic field, right? Because I thought he just slept. He said, no, I'm talking about the Earth's electric field. Don't you know about the Earth's electric field? I said, Andre, are you on some kind of drug or something like that? I never heard of the Earth's electrical field. He said to me, don't you know that the Earth is negatively charged and the ionosphere is positively charged? And it's like a capacitor with positive charges up there and negative charges down there. And if it's like a capacitor, it means you have an electric field between the top plate and the bottom plate, lines running down this way. I said, I had never heard of such a thing. What are you talking about? So I went home scratching my head. And he went off back home to Russia. This was some years ago. And next morning, one of my students comes to me with the lectures of the great physicist Richard Feynman, the Nobel laureate. Many people say this guy was the Einstein of the second half of the 20th century. And his lectures, someone wrote up the lectures that he gave at Caltech, and it appears in 3 volumes. So my student brings in volume 2, chapter 9, dog-eared, opens it up, and the chapter, I think it was titled something like The Negative Charge of the Earth or something like this. In the chapter, he describes numerous experiments and provides the evidence of all these experiments that have shown that the Earth has negative charge. It's not at all neutral. So assuming he's right, the question you might ask is, well, how come that's not taught? Well, it actually is taught in Russia. He told me that every middle school student in Russia knows that the Earth is negatively charged. And I checked that with some mature Russians who went to middle school many years ago. And they say, absolutely, we all know that. Now they don't learn it anymore. It's been dropped from the curriculum, just as it's never in the curriculum in the US. So we never learn about it. It's one of those forgotten facts, but it's so incredibly important in so many ways. And the way that you were alluding to is very simple. So if you take off your shoes and walk barefoot on the grass, on the wet grass especially, so you're electrically connected to the Earth, what happens is the electrical charge of the Earth, the electrons, will seep into that, through that connection into your body, and will go wherever it's needed, wherever there's no high concentration of negative charge. It'll go to the regions that are more positive or less negative. And by so doing, that those electrons, that current basically, will build easy water, as I mentioned, because experimentally we've shown that if you put electrons into the water, you get easy water. So if easy water is critical for health, as I believe it is, the experiments have shown that, if you're feeling ill in virtually any way, from a headache to a pain in your toe, you connect yourself to the Earth, and you should feel better. And many people do. There have been a lot of developments in the idea of earthing or grounding, And I think it's generally agreed that earthing has a positive effect on your health. But uh, and there are many speculations as to how it works. And the speculation that we would have is very simple: the electrons are running in, building easy water. You need easy water for your cells to function properly, and if you get that, you feel good. So that's the story of the Earth's negative charge, at least from my point
So
of view.
yeah, I mean, and how electron deficient are we nowadays? Because nobody's walking barefoot. But so
A few of
I
them
guess
are.
maybe my question,
I know some
yeah,
people who do it
on
on
the
a
beach.
regular basis. Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Sorry.
we do. Yeah, we preach that. No, don't worry. We've done full podcasts on grounding and earthing. I
Oh,
think it's
okay.
fantastic. It's more so the rhetoric, right? Like accessible health hacks that is not discussed in the mainstream. But I'm
Yeah.
curious, if say you have a pain in your shoulder and your feet are on the ground, like, do you think it's through the water that these electrons are, just being transported,
Well,
flowing
yeah.
throughout our
e-
entire body?
Well, yeah. Easy water has high conductivity, so it's going to pass right through all that easy water, and transport to places where there are not enough electrons and not enough easy water. And by building easy water, it improves our health because the cell needs easy water. See, I mean, the idea is that the easy water transitions into liquid water and then back again. So you need to have the easy water to start with. If you don't have it, then you can't go through that transition, and therefore the cell is not working properly. So you have a dysfunctional cell, or in extreme cases, a pathological cell.
Yeah. That, I mean, it makes sense to me, and it's yeah, obviously it's so ubiquitous in our biology, and we've talked about the interaction. And to me, what's interesting is thinking about the potential like semiconduction that may be going on. And I guess you can think of water, it's a battery, but it's kind of semiconducting in some regard. I'm curious in that light. There's been some research on compounds like melanin that show that it needs to be hydrated to be conductive in our biology, which is quite different from semiconductors or conductive materials in the, I guess, the material world we live in. So how do you think about that? And something that I've read as well is that ATP really can open up these binding sites for the proteins to be hydrated to then be conductive. Is that something you've delved into? Is that something that may be
Well,
discussed in your upcoming book?
no, not in my upcoming book, but I understand. So this piece just delivered to me comes from Arturo.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, we talked to him. We talked to him.
okay, so you know who I'm talking about in Mexico.
Yes,
Yeah.
Arturo Solis Herrera.
So yeah, Arturo is a good friend, and he talks about the energy that you can get from melatonin and such. And um, yeah, I don't have expertise on that, but what's interesting is he runs an organization called the Center for Human Photosynthesis, uh, and the theme is actually very similar to what we're talking about. That it's not just plants that do this; things that go on inside our body and build easy water. Basically, they're doing the same thing. And so the fact that his place is the Center for Human Photosynthesis, I regard as pretty interesting. I sometimes show it when I show slides to show that it's not really so way out. He's got it. But um, the other issue was ATP and the energy from ATP. And there's a story that goes on along with this, a story that's really, really important. And let me just tell you, I learned the way all of us have learned that you get your energy, or the body gets its energy from the hydrolysis of ATP, from a high energy phosphate bond in ATP. So there are three phosphates, and one of them, it was found by a prominent physical chemistry group, I think some 80 years ago or so, that one of those phosphates has high energy. And the idea that came out of their study was that that is the energy that powers everything we do. Sounds reasonable. Everybody was looking for a source of energy because before that, nobody knew where energy came from. We got a lot of energy, but where does it come from? As we discussed a moment ago, energy can only be transformed from one type to another type. And so the idea is that the high energy phosphate bond transforms itself into, let's say, energy for a muscle or any kind of energy that we deliver. And that was very fine for a short time. But a few years later, and this is brought up by Gilbert Ling, the same Gilbert Ling I'm talking about. Despite his passing, his website still exists. It's gilbertling.org. And in the website, he points out a salient fact that most of us don't know about. It was a year or two after that critical paper was published showing that ATP has a high energy phosphate bond whose energy could be released to do work. Another group, another prominent physical chemistry group, went on to study the idea of the first group, and they went through the paper very carefully, and they concluded that there is no such thing as a high energy phosphate bond. He says the guys made a simple arithmetic error in their computation, and that simple arithmetic error meant there was no such thing as a high energy phosphate bond. The sad um, aspect of all this is that apparently nobody's ever followed up on it. So since nobody's ever followed up, we don't know, is that challenge group correct in their assessment, or was the original finding correct? It's urgent that somebody goes on to study this, because what's more fundamental than the energy that runs our cells and runs our body? So there is the possibility. I don't know if it's true or not true because it hasn't been followed up. You have two different points of view. There's a possibility that there's no such thing as energy coming from ATP. It's possible. I'm not sure if it's correct or not correct, but it's possible. If so, you need a different kind of energy. And what we've been talking about is the electrical energy that from easy water. The idea that water has energy. Who would ever think that water has energy? But it does have energy because we demonstrated. We have proof of principle that you can get energy. We also have a proof of principle that energy is actually used. That kind of energy is used biologically in at least one case. And I don't want to deviate too far from your question, but we just recently published a finding that in the cardiovascular system, this easy energy is used. And if you ask me about it, I can tell you, but maybe you want to go on to other things.
Well, shoot, actually, because be interesting. We're debating what question we asked Nesk, and that actually was one of the ones we were going to go into about the heart as a pump, or how exclusion zone water like plays this role in the capillary. So maybe you can actually go into that because it's
Okay.
super fascinating.
Yeah, for me, it's absolutely fascinating. But I'll tell you the well, maybe I should start a bit historically. So I was invited to a lab in Russia. My friend at Moscow University, Vladimir Vyakov, was a prominent person studying water, and he's a real smart guy. Um, and I went on a visit some years ago, and he wanted desperately to introduce me to one of the guys down the hall who was studying the cardiovascular system. So I said, okay, I'm game. And Vladimir had to translate because the guy's English was halting, if any, and my Russian was almost zero. I know vodka and zakuska and banya and a few things, but that's about it. Okay, so he introduces me, and the guy starts talking. He tells me in the typical Russian way, there is a big problem in the cardiovascular system. I've got my nose up in the air. What's he going to tell me that I don't already know? I did my PhD um, doing computer simulation of the pressures and flows in the cardiovascular system. So I kind of knew something about it, and I thought we had all the problems solved, more or less problems solved. And he starts going on and on. Within 5 minutes, um, although I was quite resistant to start with, he had me convinced that he was right. And so what's the problem? So the problem is that the narrowest vessels that your capillaries, and there are many of them, they're down to maybe 3 or 4 micrometers in diameter. The red blood cells are twice the diameter. They're 6 or 7 microns in diameter. So how on earth do you do you get these giant red blood cells? They're not giant, but relatively speaking, to pass through these narrow capillaries. Well, you got to squeeze them. Um, the red blood cells. You've seen pictures of them, and it has the shape of a donut, kind of. But you got to kind of squeeze the donut, right, in order to pass through these narrow vessels. And the guy was telling me that the energy that's required is monumental. And he made some computations. Of course, we never know if someone's computations are correct, but he said that he came up with an order of magnitude of the energy that's required to push those red blood cells through. And he said if the ventricle is responsible, left ventricle, the pressure developed by the left ventricle, he said, if that is actually responsible for pushing those cells through the small capillaries, the pressure would need to be something like 1,000,000 times the pressure that actually exists. So even if he's off by 1 or 2 orders of magnitude, it's impossible that the heart could be responsible. He said there's got to be another source of energy driving the flow in the cardiovascular system. So he starts going on a half dozen ideas involving bubbles and other stuff. And I'm thinking, you know, we just have some finding in the laboratory that could be awfully relevant. And that is, we took tubes, took a tube. You could think of the tube as a blood vessel because it's much the same. Both tubes have hydrophilic surfaces. The interior of the blood cell, the endothelium as such, and the tubes that we were using were indeed that way. And we found that if we took the tube and we immersed the tube horizontally in water, that flow would pass through the tube just like through a straw. It kept going, and essentially no end to it. There was an end, but it went for a very long time. And I'm wondering, we found out how this system works, how the flow occurs, and I'm wondering whether it might apply in the cardiovascular system. So the way the flow occurs is this. So this is the tube in cross section. It's a circle, and just inside that circle is a layer of easy water, negatively charged, and at the center, the core of the vessel, are protons. Because remember, I said that when easy forms, protons form as well, or hydronium ions. And so what you got at the center of the vessel, you've got a bunch of hydronium ions. They're suspended in the water. They repel each other. They want to get away from each other as much as possible. So they'll exit either this end of the tube or this end of the tube, depending on certain situation. And so basically, this flow is driven by the energy from easy water. And you can make it go faster if you add infrared energy, or slower. That's the key, is the infrared energy is building all this stuff. So I'm wondering, is it possible that the explanation for this Russian guy's stuff comes from what we saw in the laboratory? And we tested it, and it was just published a couple of months ago. And we tested the signature feature of this flow mechanism, and that is it's run on infrared energy. So you put in more infrared energy, it goes faster. So we tested, or I should say, my student Li Jing tested in the cardiovascular system of a chick embryo. It's a system where you got pretty much the full cardiovascular system, but you don't have the hormonal regulatory system and the neurological regulatory system, so it's pretty pure. So the first thing he did was to stop the heart. And what he found, incidentally, what you and I would have expected, and everybody else would expect, is the flow would stop immediately if the heart's not beating. But the flow continued, And Lee told me he checked the literature, and there are at least a half dozen reports over the past 100 years showing that if you stop the heart, the blood doesn't stop. It flows more slowly, but it keeps going on for a substantial period of time, which parenthetically raises the question of how do you define death? um, you know, it's an interesting subject. So, um, so there has to be something else besides the heart. And as I said, we were testing to see if this mechanism, this flow mechanism that we found inside the laboratory might be there. And the signature feature of this phenomenon is it's run on infrared energy. So if you were to increase infrared energy, you expect the flow, that residual flow after the heart stops, you'd expect it to increase. And we found exactly that by leaps and bounds. It increases when you add infrared energy. So we concluded that we can't conclude, we can't say for sure that this is the answer, but we think the results are consistent with the possibility that that extra boost that you need to run the cardiovascular system beyond the heart um, comes from the infrared energy building easy water, creating charge, and basically propelling the flow. And we don't know from our experiments whether this is 1% of the energy or 99% of the energy. For technical reasons, we couldn't figure out the answer to that question. But anyway, just to summarize, this is one instance inside the body where we're pretty confident that infrared energy and easy water are running the show. Not
Yeah,
18.
we talked to Dr. Thomas Cowan about this, and I think he's a big fan of your work. And it's just incredible, right? Like, there's so much to learn. I feel like in this realm, um, because there's been so many, just just it's a cracked foundation, I guess, of beliefs. Really, like we think we know everything, we really don't. So the research, the inquisitive nature, the pushing the frontiers has just been absent for a while. So it's awesome that you're doing this work. We'd love to see more of it, and something to transition to that is relevant to Russia because they're way more cognizant of it. It's relative to the heart because the heart is a large source of it. Is something I think about a lot as an electrical engineer that has also been swept under the rug, and that's how the rest of the electromagnetic spectrum affects our biology. And for you, the question is how that affects our exclusion zone water. So, going instead of having DC current, having AC fields around them or around us as a result of technology.
Well, I'm sorry. What is your question exactly?
Sorry. So the question is, how have you've published papers saying that magnetic fields affect the exclusion zone. I'm curious, how have you what have you measured at different frequencies, and how do they vary and how they affect the exclusion zone, and what experiments would you like to do more of, or how does AC current versus DC current affect the exclusion zone?
Well, I'm a little embarrassed to tell you that we studied that, but we haven't been able to publish it, or we haven't published it. There was a student who did the experiments, um, and the experiments he took this chamber that I've been talking about, where we can see the exclusion zone, um, and he put a router um, next to it, and he turned on the router to see how it impacted the exclusion zone. And it reduced the size of the exclusion zone, which is essentially a negative effect. And if the result is true and valid, it means possibly that the electromagnetic radiation that comes from the router is not good for our health. However, something happened. I don't know. I tried to contact the student to ask him a few questions, begin working on manuscript, which he actually started. But I've attempted to get hold of him numerous times, and I simply can't get a hold of him. So I'm reluctant to publish the result because I'm concerned that because I can't get hold of the student, I'm not absolutely sure if the results are correct. Usually a student will do the stuff and we'll write it together, and I'll be asking him myriad questions about such to just make sure that everything's okay. But I can't do all these experiments myself. I just don't have the time to do it. So I don't know the answer. I thought we had an answer, and the answer would have been that the electromagnetic radiation coming from the router, at least, has a negative impact, but I'm not sure. See, so I apologize for that, but that's exactly the situation. We have other maybe more interesting effects that I'm really confident of it, and that is we found that if we impose um, an electrical field or electromagnetic energy, AC field, to water, we found that certain frequencies will convert that water to EZ water, and other frequencies won't. Um, and when when the postdoc who was doing that reported it to me, I scratched my head and said, "This doesn't make sense." I'm not sure I understand why it's so specific to frequency. And why should certain frequencies build easy water and other frequencies not at all? But then when I started using myself PEMF, you're aware of and that involves um, supplying electromagnetic frequencies for certain issues that you may have, and I've had a few, and it seems to work. Then it made sense because there's specific frequencies that do it, not every frequency or any frequency. So I can imagine that certain frequencies could be beneficial in that they build easy water, while other frequencies, uh, this really needs to be studied. So we're just at the beginning of it. Other frequencies may have negative effects. So this is a field that is wide open for study. Uh, but studying this is a little bit awkward because politics get in the way. People, for example, the manufacturers of cell phones don't particularly appreciate that you're doing kinds of studies like this, et cetera, et cetera. You know what I mean. Um, so it becomes awkward. Um, anyway, I'd like to comment on some point that you raised a few minutes ago about people that are reluctant to entertain ideas that run against the mainstream. There tends to be a lot of conservatism in science, and one of the reasons why that's the case has to do with bread and butter, um, money, and such. So uh, I'm in. Well, let's say one of you guys, maybe Tristan, you're in a lab, you're doing science, right? And in order to do science, you need money. You can't have a lab if you want to hire some people to be lab assistants or whatever, you got to pay for it. If you need supplies, you got to pay. If you need a microscope, you got to buy it, etc. So unless you have a wealthy benefactor, which I was actually lucky to have for a few years until he ran into some financial difficulty. If you have that, and perhaps you can do it. Otherwise, you depend on government grants. Now, what happens? Um, so let's say I give you a good example of the difficulty in getting grants if your ideas run against the mainstream. I always like this example, so if you've heard it, I apologize. Let's say you look out the window, and I looking out my window, I see Lake Washington. I live in Seattle, and it looks flat, and so it's easy to deduce from that the Earth is flat. So let's say that everybody around you knows that the Earth is flat, but you're a curious guy, and you've seen some evidence that, well, the Earth might actually be round or spherical. You've seen images from satellites and from the moon, and the Earth seems to have some kind of curvature to it. And to amplify that, you've taken trips around the world. You've flown from where you are in the mountains somewhere in the west. You took a short hop to Seattle, and then you went on to Tokyo, and you kept going west, and you wound up in London, and you come back to New York, and then finally wind up at home. So you've gone all around the world and come back to the same place. And if the Earth is flat, it seems incompatible with that idea. But if the Earth is a sphere, then it's perfectly compatible. So you put together this so-called preliminary evidence, right? That's the jargon that's used, preliminary evidence. And you go to some funding agency, it could be the National Science Foundation or some other agency, and you've written your proposal and you submit it to them. And the gatekeeper receives your proposal and says, "Oh, this guy Tristan, I'm not sure I know him. I don't know if the guy is a genius or a crackpot, you know." And in order to evaluate this proposal, asking for money, suggesting that the Earth is round instead of flat. You know, we all know it's flat, but maybe this guy has something to say that's significant. So the gatekeeper will say, "Well, I better hire some of the world's experts to review his proposal, you know, and see if he's a crackpot or see if this makes sense." So who does he hire? He hires the experts on the shape of the Earth. They're the flat Earth people. So what it means is that you're proposing the Earth is round, and the people who are reviewing it know that the Earth is flat. And if it turns out that you're right, it means they're wrong, and their reputations will fall flat. Now, if you consider human nature, you can kind of understand what their reaction is going to be. You know, nobody wants to get deplatformed that way, or banned from the face of science, or embarrassing. And so they're going to find reason why your proposal is not good enough to be funded. And because your proposal is not good enough to be funded, you can now multiply that experience by all the people who have ideas that run against the mainstream. They'll always find mainstream people to review your idea, just the people you're challenging. And therefore, there's almost no chance of getting money. I've been sort of lucky a few times, but mostly they won't even read my proposal. They'll just kind of throw it. "Oh, this is not interesting. I won't spend my time reading through it." The system is set up so that the reviewers, out of a pile of proposals, can pick out the ones that they think are most interesting. Proposal that, on which they know something about and they can speak, and the recipient will be very happy because they all know one another. But the radical proposals that are suggesting that they may have an opportunity to change the paradigm in a really major way almost never get supported. And that's why we've had so few scientific revolutions in the past 30 or 40 years. I would challenge you to name. There are plenty of technological revolutions, you know, like uh, this phone here, or my laptop. You know, those are technological revolutions supported by investments. But in terms of true scientific revolutions that have changed your life, just like, for example, the splitting of the atom, or the discovery of the genetic code, that is like 70 and 60 years respectively. Can you name one of the same magnitude, a scientific discovery of the same magnitude that has changed your life in the past 30 or 40 years? I'm not sure you can. Maybe you can. You need to think about it, but most people could not. And I think the reason has to do with the system of funding science. It's not done maliciously. It's not done to stamp out revolutions. It's just the way the system is set up. It doesn't work. So, you know, there's plenty of incremental stuff, and the PR offices of universities are, you know, spouting out mounds of information. "Oh, someone in my university discovered a promising cure for cancer." Promising. You know, it hasn't done it, but it promises it might do it, et cetera, et cetera. And there's competition among those public relations people, news releases and such. So we get the impression that so much is going on, and science is at its peak. But in fact, it's more like the nadir than the peak, because all the stuff that's happening is incremental. And if the truth lies somewhere else, it's going to be difficult to discover that truth. And secondly, if you build on a foundation that's not true, which I think a lot of foundations these days are, if the foundation is cracked, you're not going to get a stable structure to build on that. So many of the things that we're, quote, discovering, even though it's incremental, it's probably wrong. Okay,
Yeah.
enough for my lecture. I'm
That's
sorry.
no, I mean, look, we're decentralized radio for a reason. We talk about all sorts of alternative health. I mean, they're alternative just because of exactly what you said, right? But we also talk about the issues with our monetary system, and the incentives are misaligned across the board. That's why you get, lower quality food. I mean, the healthcare system's a mess. You get this issue in academia and science. It's all based on what? Your return on investment. So I don't think you can make money on studying water too well compared to a pharmaceutical compound, for example. Not saying those aren't necessary in life threatening conditions, but to me, I'm a geek on EMFs, and I'm reading Robert O. Becker's work, which is still like the cutting edge of EMFs. And that was written 20, 30 years ago. So to me, it's a real problem, but I do see a resurgence. I do see a lot of people becoming very interested in, your work, all this alternative esoteric health topics that you could call it. And eventually I think it will turn around, and that's why we do this podcast. But didn't at one point you have like a fund to help support other types of research, or what is the best way to get private investors or someone to help fund? Because I've talked about this with other researchers as well, and they kind of say the same issue.
Well, yeah. So there are two questions that you have. How do you get a private investment, and the other is is there a way or a system that exists to fund revolutionary science? And so what I've learned, maybe I'm not very successful, um, but I've learned either you have to have good luck, and the funder I mentioned, the private funder, came to me. He read my book, The Fourth Phase of Water, and he said, "This is truth that's coming from there." And he sent an emissary to contact me. Uh, he said, the emissary finally said, after spending a couple of hours on lunch and talking over stuff, he said, "The real reason I'm here is to find out about you." He said, "I know some very rich people, and they would like to fund you based on what they read in your book. They think you're onto something really important, but they don't know you. Are you a crackpot, or are you a crazy guy, or are you reasonable?" So I guess I passed the test, the lunch test, and they thought of me as being reasonable. And so they went on to fund me for, I think it was 4 years, 5 years, very nicely funded. Um, so that's one way of getting the money, but somehow these people need to be attracted. I think people who have friends who are wealthy, that's another vehicle for getting funded. Some people who have been successful in funding have told me that their success lies in their friendship with people. They know their wives' birthdays, and they know their hobbies and whatever. So that is one way. But about 7 or 8 years ago, we developed, out of frustration, that people with revolutionary ideas can't get funded, and this is the essence of science. Scientific revolutions is really where it is. That's where science moves. It really moves. Um, but they're not occurring. And so I asked myself, what can we do to improve the situation? And so we developed a foundation based on principles that I think might actually work. And I was naive enough at first to think that the government might fund it, but I found out no way. And so we're dependent on private funders, and we got some private funding, but not much. And we're about to go on a marketing scheme, and we have a way that we think will be successful in getting appreciable amounts of money. And the way the scheme works is, for your, let's say, Ryan, Tristan, your round Earth proposal, you can't get money from this foundation, but you apply to us. We've gone through one round already. You apply to us, and you say, in a 2-page pre-proposal, you say, I think the Earth is round, and it's really important because of X, Y, Z. And here's some evidence to support our point of view, briefly. And it's read by reviewers who we appoint, and we actually pay for their work. Reviewers who I know personally in different fields, and I know are open-minded, um, and And we choose reviewers who are outside the field of the shape of the Earth, because if you if you get reviewers who are in the shape of the Earth field, they'll probably be flat Earth people, and that you want neutral reviewers. You don't want people who oppose you. However, um, in order for us to judge better whether your round Earth proposal is valid or not, we ask you to name half dozen people who would ordinarily challenge you. Those might be the world's experts on flat Earth. And we ask them and pay them also for writing a critique of your pre-proposal. What's wrong? What's wrong with Tristan's proposal? Why is he wrong? And why does everybody really know the Earth is flat? And so and we receive these questions, and you get an interview, and you're interviewed by your reviewers, who say, okay, Tristan, here we got three responses from the flat Earth people, and they say XYZ. How do you respond to that? And if you respond well, and remember, the reviewers are out of your field. They don't care if the Earth is flat or the Earth is round. If you respond well, those are good points in your favor, because you're able to defend yourself. If you don't get any response, any questions, unfortunately, you can't have the pleasure of that experience. Anyway, so out of that, we got 200, more than 200 pre-proposals in different fields, and we picked out the top 15. We invited them to submit full proposals, with the understanding that we'd pick out maybe 1/3 of them for possible funding. And so you might or might not be in that group, but we were able to pick out 5. And we haven't yet been able to fund any, because our funds are not quite at that level. But here's the key: one more option. Suppose we did have enough money to fund you appreciably, rather than just a few $10,000s, which would do nothing for you. If we could fund you appreciably, and let's say you do more studies, and you find that the Earth is a sphere, it's not flat, you won't succeed. And the reason you won't succeed is that the same problem would exist then as exists now, only more serious. They'd say, oh, Tristan, he's a crackpot. Don't pay any attention to him. He doesn't know what he's talking about, and so you'll be quickly dismissed from any kind of scientific credibility, because they don't like your finding. And you lose, despite the fact that you've had money, you've obtained successful results, but you still lose, you see. So how do you remedy that? Well, that's what makes our organization unique. If we fund you, we're going to identify 10 or 12 other laboratories that are doing experiments that are along the same lines as yours. Maybe not exactly the same. Maybe they're using different techniques, but they're generally philosophically in tune with what you're doing. And we fund them all. Now, next year at the Shape of the Earth Society, we got a dozen people coming from different labs using different techniques that are saying that the Earth is a sphere, it's not flat. And the young students who are coming to the conferences, they're open-minded. They pay attention. They say to their mentor, hey, I was just in this session, and there are a dozen guys who are saying the Earth is round. Maybe it's not flat after all. What do you think, Professor? And the professor, I don't like that stuff. But the students are open-minded, And so it's our estimate that within 2 or 3 years, there will be a scientific revolution. Multiply that by many different fields, and science becomes alive again. So that's the Institute for Venture Science, ivscience.org, if anybody's interested. And we're looking for private funds, and that right now that's a limitation, and it's a limitation because we haven't been very good at marketing what we have. But people who are aware of what we're doing, they love it, and they think this is the way to go. So anyway, that's the answer to there is an organization, it exists, and we're running it, and we're hopeful that very soon we're going to get substantial amounts of money. This is exactly what's needed.
Yeah, I think it has to come from the community, right? If we want to see this change, we need to support ourselves. So anyone listening, if you have some side cash, if you're a Bitcoiner and want to support Gerald's work with your new appreciated net worth, definitely check it out. It's something I personally have been, trying to get more attention around as well, and I would like to hold more events on fundraising. I mean, it's to me almost the most important thing in science. Um,
I'm
so I
sorry.
appreciate you sharing that.
What is the most important thing? I didn't hear you.
Funding
Funding is. Oh,
research
okay.
that
Sure. Yeah.
questions, that could potentially revolutionize the way we think about science,
Yeah. Absolutely.
basically. So everything you're talking about. So maybe my last question here, and then we're going to turn it over to Ryan to do some audience questions. Is there's a lot of other there's not I should not say a lot of other researchers, but there's quite a few really good researchers in the water field that I've read, and the likes of Emilio Del Giudice, and then also way early is Victor Schauberger. How have these minds kind of influenced the way you think about water, and were people like Victor like ever on your radar as like maybe there's more to this than just what we think about water, or was it mostly just Gilbert Ling in the beginning?
No, I think it was all of the above. I should mention, you mentioned Emilio Del Giudice. He unfortunately passed about 6 or 7 years ago, and I would invite him annually. We run a conference called the Annual Conference on the Physics, Chemistry, and Biology of Water. It'll be held in Lisbon, uh, middle of October this year. It's um, uh, it, if anybody's interested, it's WaterConf, CONF. That's for conference. WaterConf.org is the URL. And it's a fantastic meeting. It puts together people who have interesting scientific reports, and it's become kind of an almost like family type of get together. People have we're up to meeting number 16, I think it is, annual meeting, and people get to know one another. It becomes a community. And Emilio was amazing. So he had an idea. It was called coherent domains of water. It turns out that coherent domains are actually just a different way of expressing what we found. Also, the two are roughly equivalent, just expressed in different ways. Um, so my way is maybe more traditional, and his way or their way uh, deals deals with quantum electrodynamics. So for many people, that's hard to digest, and but it seems that the two approaches are equivalent. So that's one person, and I think he's built a large following of people, particularly from Italy. He was an amazing guy. He'd get up on the podium, and you give him a subject, and he could speak for a half hour on that subject extemporaneously without batting an eyelash. Didn't matter what the topic was. He was that kind of guy, and wonderful sense of humor. So people would really appreciate him, and he's really missed now by a lot of people. And then there was Victor Schauberger. Um, so he was not a scientist; he was a naturalist, and one of the and by the way, there's a museum at Austria at a place called Bad Ischl, where they demonstrate some of his findings. And so he was the first working to solve engineering problems in Austria. And there was a problem of logging. So you cut down a log that was way up high in a mountain, and it would go down a chute, and the chute had water in it, and the logs would come down to the place where they have a sawmill. But if a log got stuck, you'd have to dislodge it before you could do anything else. One log would block the whole thing. And he was able to figure out it had to do with the water and the temperature of the water and such, a way in which you could avert all such problems. He then figured out about um, um, so-called living water as opposed to dead water. So living water is water that's been moving around a lot, and dead water is just basically sitting there. And that concept has found its way into science quite a lot. It's not been forgotten, despite the fact that the transmission of information from him to the rest of the world was cumbersome because he didn't speak the same scientific language. So there have been a lot of people who have translated some of his stuff, and some in ways that are better than others. Eventually, Schauberger, when the Nazis took over Austria, they offered Schauberger an opportunity. Either, if he wanted to keep working, he'd have to be working on devices that were useful for wartime. And so one of the devices he worked on was basically a flying saucer. And you'd think flying saucer, this is impossible, but there were records showing that he had achieved that. And when the war was over, unfortunately, the various governments either stole the records or got rid of them or something like that. And we don't have access to it, although there are some images of some lifting devices um, that he built, worked on. So we don't know everything there is to know about Schauberger, but I'm looking forward to. I'll be presenting a seminar in Austria right near Bad Ischl, and I'm looking forward to going there and visiting, see what the place is like. So yes, some of these pioneers have had real influence on our understanding of water, especially actually vortices, because Schauberger was talking about vortices. So um, you have a vortex, and the water is living water that's inside the vortex. Okay, well, anyway, I hope that answers your questions about those two guys.
No, that's awesome. That's such a the UFO thing just got me thinking about Bob Lazar and like that huge rabbit hole that I went down like 2 years ago when I had nothing better to do with my life. But that's a whole nother topic. We have a few like sort of rapid fire questions on Twitter. So these are more like concise answer questions, but maybe kind of fun to do. It's the first time we're doing them.
Okay.
I wanted to ask something about deuterium because we had Stephanie Seneff on the show. Tristan talked to her about deuterium and mitochondrial health. And I wondered what you made of this idea of deuterium being detrimental to mitochondrial health and maybe its relationship to exclusion zone water.
We're studying that right now.
That's exciting.
So we got our supply of deuterium depleted water, which is right here. I'm drinking it right now. I know there are
Nice.
many reports that it's good for health, and so I have a hypothesis, but we have no evidence yet. We're just starting these experiments, the first run of experiments, and the idea is if easy water is a crystal, crystals are pure, and if you have a pure crystal, it will grow practically indefinitely. If you have an impure crystal, it doesn't grow as extensively, as rapidly. And so most ordinary water, even laboratory water, has some deuterium, D2O, heavy water, instead of H2O, or in addition to the H2O. So one molecule out of, I don't know how many thousands, will be deuterium, D2O, instead of H2O. And if so, that will um, inhibit the growth of EZ, limit the growth of EZ, because they're basically impurities. It's a different molecule. Um, so that's the hypothesis, and we don't know if it's true, but it means if it's true, if it's valid, it means that if you have water that has no deuterium or very little deuterium, the EZ should grow better, more extensively, and if it grows more extensively, it should be good for health. So we'll find out in the next couple of months whether that hypothesis is validated or not.
That's so cool. I'm very excited about that. That kind of naturally leads into my next question from Steffa Jansen from Twitter. And I know this for a fact that you've been asked this one quite a few times, so we can probably get through it pretty quickly. And it's sort of an open-ended question. But the question is, when it comes to drinking water, what are things we should think about optimizing the water that we drink? I know you've tested many different types of water yourself, just drinking like vortex water, like spring water, tap water. And you've spoken about that in other podcasts. But is there anything else you can give to our audience as far as approaching drinking water to be more beneficial?
It's a difficult topic because there are many companies who are producing all kinds of waters, and I get asked practically on a daily basis. I get
I
an
bet.
email. The email starts, "Oh, I've been following your stuff. Thank you very much. Blah blah blah. Which water should I drink?" And my response is all the same, always the same. We haven't tested these waters, and other people claim various health benefits to their particular water that they're selling. But it may be true, it may not be true. Until the water is tested, I can't be sure. One of the waters that, well, first of all, generically, I think, now this is, I think, this doesn't mean it's true. This is what I think. I think that some kinds of spring water should be good for your health because some of the spring water, not all, some of them have a high EZ content. And I think that according to our studies, waters with high EZ content or high structured water content or high fourth phase water content, any way you want to describe it, should have the capacity to help build structured water in your body. And you need this kind of easy fourth phase water in your body to be healthy. So, in theory, such water should be good for health. And some of the waters that are sold commercially are touted to contain fourth phase water or easy water. I have no idea if that's true or not true because we haven't tested them. So we don't test waters because if we started testing waters, pretty much that's all we'd be doing, and we're not in the water testing mode. We're in mode of doing fundamental research, even well beyond water. If we get to that, um, that's what's of interest to us. So I guess if I had to give one piece of advice or one conjecture or one speculation is really the right word, I'd say that some spring waters, we've checked a few of them, and I've seen results from another laboratory. Some of them are rich in EZ water, um, and those should be good for your health. It's kind of like juicing is good for your health. You go to the backyard, um, and my late wife did this to keep us healthy for a while, and you pick out some freshly grown uh, leaves from plants, vegetables, and such. Pull them, put them in a machine that squeezes them to death, squeezes out the water. So, what is that water? Well, the water is is the fluid from inside the plant cells, and that fluid and plant cells, just like animal cells, are filled with easy water. And these are freshly grown plants, so they probably are really healthy and they've got a lot of easy water. So, what you're doing if you do this juicing is you're extracting the juice from the plants, easy water from the plants, and drinking easy water. And it's no surprise that this is one of the best things you can do for your health if you've got a backyard with plants. So I guess that's pretty much the sort of generic advice that I would give. But you need to know that the particular, I mean, the juicing is one thing that I think a lot of health practitioners claim is really effective. But in terms of drinking water, I can't say much more than what I've said in that speculation. That some some waters, some spring waters, uh, should be and are filled with easy, so that you're basically swallowing easy water, which should enhance the easy water, should help build easy water in your body.
Yeah, no, and that makes total sense. That's sort of what I expected you to say, but I figured I'd had to ask it because there was at least 5 or 6 of those, which was basically the same question. I was like, hey, we'll handle it really quickly. But I appreciate that answer because yeah, it is sort of nuanced. Jeff in the chat on YouTube actually had a pretty good question. Jeff Gibson about infrared light and cancer, and I've heard you talk about in other podcasts cancer potentially having less exclusion zone water in the cancer cell, and he was asking about well, well, his question is: have you convinced any other colleagues to treat cancer growth with infrared light? Um,
Well, the paper so far that we wrote, it seems to be getting around before it's
yeah,
even been reviewed. we've gotten rejected so far twice before review. The editor seems to think that our manuscript is not worth review, and I'm not sure, but this has not happened a lot in the past. But many of the journals are, are run by a large organization, and these organizations very often have people from the pharmaceutical companies, and um, and so if the place is run or has some people on the board from the pharmaceutical companies who might be protective of the pharmaceuticals, something that challenges the pharmaceutical companies might not be taken in a positive way. I'm not sure if that's the reason, but at any rate, we're about to, or I'm about to submit the paper again. I think it has merit, and I think is pretty interesting. And it's true. The idea, and I adduce evidence to support the idea, is that cancer cells don't have much easy water. Uh, and I think I wouldn't say it's a fact, but the evidence leans so strongly. So really, what you want to do to reverse the cancer is to build easy water. And so there are a number of ways that you can build easy water. Um, and infrared is one of them. So I would suggest and have suggested in the manuscript that a sauna would be one excellent approach to doing this, because sauna is basically heat, and heat is the consequence of infrared energy, the manifestation of it. So that's why you feel good after you've been in the sauna for a while, because the infrared energy, the heat, infrared energy builds easy water. So your body will have more easy water than before you entered into the sauna. So yeah, that would be one therapeutic approach to cancer. But I've um, I've met some physicians who already are using that. There's one guy I met. I wish I could remember his name. I met him in Germany, and he told me about using infrared light on cancer around the face. So he said young women would come and say, I've got this cancer on my nose or my ear or cheek or whatever, and they're suggesting surgery. And of course, young woman doesn't want surgery. That's on her face. That's the last thing she wants, because there'll be scars all over the place. He said he uses an infrared lamp. That's all he uses, and the cancer disappears. So it's anecdotal, I know, but it certainly fits with the hypothesis. Um, that you add infrared light, builds easy water, and cancer cells are deficient in easy water, so you can restore the cell from pathological, or at least dysfunctional, back to normal by adding infrared light. So yeah, that's a good question.
I love it. Well, it's all my favorite things, getting sun, getting in a sauna or a hot springs, even getting cold, right? Because then you're upregulating your body's own production of heat. Maybe that's the
Well,
fins are
yeah,
onto something.
yeah. So sure. I mean, the core of your body, metabolism, is producing heat, and the heat then goes from the core of your body through the periphery to outside. In passing through the rest of your body, the infrared energy is building easy water. So you got it from inside, you got it from outside, you got it from the sun, you got it from metabolism. So
It
it's
it
there.
makes sense. It makes sense that why the Scandinavian countries do these things when there's less energy from the sun. It's almost like, okay, we need to do more now in our environment because there's less light energy. It seems like that just always kind of works out over, millennia. But Dr. Pollack, want to be cognizant of your time. So we're done with the questions. Besides, the last one is about your next book, your next thing you're working on. I've heard you talk about it in a couple podcasts. I know it's kind of been uh, on plan for a while, and it's more about water and electricity, I believe. But maybe you could fill me in on the latest and our listeners in, because I'm
Yeah. Well,
personally
first I should
extremely
say,
excited about
yeah, there's been a delay because the artist is my son, who is absolutely
it.
talented and gifted artist, and he took 3.5 years to remodel his home. so, so I've got several books on the agenda. That next book is ready and in process right now, and I've got one more that is just about ready after that, about the structure of the atom, which I think is wrong, the one that we've
Nice.
come to accept, and another one about volcanoes and earthquakes that's first drafted, and I'm working on one on cell biology. So I like to write books. But the next one is called, if I can remember the title, it's called Charged, is the main word. The um, unexpected role of electricity in the workings of nature. So what does that mean? So I deal with various aspects of nature, and the argument is that electrical charge is central to all that, all of those issues and features. So I deal with subjects that range from the creation of weather, uh, the driving of winds, the rotation of the Earth, the origin of gravitation, um, an understanding of weather from first principles. How do you get from first principles to thunderstorms or hurricanes? I got 4 chapters on that. To how birds fly and how fish swim, and even how airplanes fly, um, and how sailboats sail. That's maybe not exactly natural, but I had to include it. So I deal with, with each one of these topics, and I first demonstrate that current understanding works in only a very superficial way, and that there are arguments that simply don't fit, simple arguments that, and so if there are arguments that don't fit, you either sweep the arguments under the rug, hoping that someone in the future will eventually dredge them out and make them fit in some way, because you presume that current knowledge must be correct, and therefore anything that doesn't fit will eventually fit, just sort of slough it off. It's not the approach I take. You know, if certain features don't fit, then you got to think about some other paradigms that maybe explain things better. In all of these features, I show that electrical charge is absolutely at work, and that if you take into account the electrical charges, starting with the electrical charge of the Earth that we talked about, um, if you start with that, you can explain many of these things. I believe, and I think I'm demonstrating better than you can explain them if you stick with the standard configuration or idea. So that's what that book is about, and um, I'm excited about it. It's just now undergoing a layout and proofreading and such, and I hope it'll be out in the next several months. Uh, so then I've got another, as I mentioned, I've got another book dealing with the structure of the atom. So um, I'm convinced that the model of the atom that we've all learned and we've presumed must be true, because it's been in textbooks for 5 generations. So therefore, it must be true. With a nucleus with protons and neutrons and electrons floating around that, or electron clouds. Um, is that model adequate? And I come to the conclusion, based on very simple principles that a middle schooler can understand, it's got to be wrong. And if it's wrong, there must be something else. If you ask me a question, I can tell you why I think it's wrong in simple terms. But um,
Why is it wrong? Quickly.
okay, thank you very much. Okay, so uh, I'll just give you 2 out of a half dozen reasons. Um, First, the nucleus. So nucleus has protons and neutrons. Protons have positive charge. You put positive charges close to one another, and what do they want to do? They want to they want to get away from one another. So the nucleus should explode. Well, this is one, you might call it a nuclear explosion. uh, this is tongue in cheek. This is one where the physicists actually have recognized that this is a problem. Because obviously those tightly packed protons want to just get away from each other. And they invented something. It's called the strong force. You might know about the strong force. The strong force is a kind of glue that glues those protons together. and make sure it doesn't explode. But there's no evidence for a strong force. It's just presumed that it must be true because the model must be correct. And in order for the model to be correct, you must have something to hold to prevent those protons from exploding. Okay, so that's just one issue that has been dealt with, but not in it's like a band-aid to cover a gaping wound. But there's something else that maybe is even more obvious. The, the, the nucleus is positive. It's surrounded by electrons. The electrons are negative. I learned in middle school or junior high, we called where I grew up, that minus and plus attract one another. So the electrons are attracted to the nucleus, and nothing is preventing those electrons from collapsing onto the nucleus because they're attracted. So it means the entire atom should disintegrate to a point. You have no atom anymore. You have a point, a neutral point, and this is a problem. So these are, I'm just giving you two problems out of a whole bunch of them. And if you can either say, well, since we know the model, this so-called solar system model, must be correct, someone will find out how these issues can be resolved in the future. We'll just sweep them under the carpet from now, and that's essentially what's done. But I don't agree with that philosophy, and so I've come forth with another model that I think, and I've demonstrated in the book, works better. It explains more things more simply. So that's book number 2. And I can give you more. I've book just quickly. Book number 3 about volcanoes and earthquakes. So living in Seattle, we could we're right near Mount St. Helens. Mount St. Helens blew. It blew off the top third or so of the whole mountain. You need energy for that. Where does the energy come from? That's what I deal with. And the same for earthquakes. You get land masses that basically are slipping past one another, and strain is built, and suddenly something comes along and releases the strain, and you get an earthquake. And we're due for a 9.1 in Seattle in the next. We're overdue right now. It occurs periodically every 250 years, and we're at roughly 300. So I know in my own home where I'm sitting right now, it's sitting on a slope, and it might happen that this house slides down the hill. I don't know if and when, but yeah. So where does the energy come from? And in the book, I argue that the energy is actually in some way coming from water. Maybe it's too much to explain in this brief time, but it's not complicated. And well, first review of that paper comes from people in my laboratory this coming weekend. I'm looking forward to that. They're going to tell me why it's all nonsense, wrong. I always do that because I get good feedback from the lab. And finally, I just began a book on cell biology. So I've got a whole line of books that are basically waiting to be published. And I guess the limiting factor has been my son, the artist. I will never go to another artist because he is, if you've looked at the fourth phase book, you'll see the artwork is fantastic. He has a real understanding of the material. He's great with cartoons. It's all sort of fun to look at, and also really good at illustrating principles that would otherwise seem complicated in a simple way. Anyway, so those are the books that we're talking about. And of course, I'm happy to discuss any aspect of any of the books, but I think we're now over time. So
I appreciate you sharing that. That's really exciting. I knew about Charge, the Charge book, but not the rest. Actually, I may have heard you mention the Atom. It's awesome that there's so many paradigms, like crack foundations that you can attack. So it's really exciting for people like Ryan and myself to be able to read your work, and
well,
then we
thank
can
you.
think critically about that. So Dr. Pollack, really appreciate your time. We'll have to connect once I read the next book that comes out for sure. Ryan and I are stoked about it. And yeah,
Well, thank
thanks so
you.
much for
I
tuning
really
in.
appreciate your interest. That means a lot. Thank you. It's been my pleasure. And so please take care, and we'll see you.
Thanks everyone for joining, and check out Dr. Pollack's books. Check out the fund website. We'll link that all below so it's easy for you all. Thanks for tuning in and asking questions.
Okay, take care. I'm